Okay, well, here I am still in San Francisco at my conference, and I just thought I would say a little something about cognitive decline. When some of us reach a certain age, we start experiencing a little slippage, as no doubt everyone knows. There are ways to test this kind of informally. Usually, you can tell just by talking to somebody if they're losing it a little bit. But if you wanted to test it a little more thoroughly, you could ask them whether they can remember things. The most common way a neurologist or psychiatrist or medical doctor will do this is asking them to remember three things. I usually say leather belt, rubber ball, and the color blue. They're nouns, and then I use those modifiers as a way of trying to give them some hints if need be. So I ask them to repeat those three things back to me, and if they can do that, that's a good immediate recall. Sometimes people can't do that. The memory has slipped enough. Then I ask them again 5 minutes later whether they can do, even though we've been talking about other things, whether they remember those things. And sometimes, if I remember, I ask them, 20 minutes later, see if they can still remember. So that's one way of determining someone's slippage. Another way, though, is the matter of abstraction. That's one of the first capacities to go, to think in layers. Sometimes we ask people to follow 2 or 3 step commands. Take that piece of paper, fold it in thirds, and put it in an envelope. If they can do that, it sounds funny, but when people have strokes or serious dementia, they have trouble doing that. And you don't want to embarrass them by asking them questions, but you do want to know. And one of them, the very first thing to go besides immediate recall or recent memory, is the capacity to think abstractly. And you can test that fairly easily. You ask them, say, similarities. That's a very common one. How are an apple and an orange similar? If they say they're both fruit, then that's fairly abstract. And that's what you want, to put those two things up into a class that's more abstract than what they might say, which is they're both round. That's fairly concrete, and some people are not too good at this ever, even when they're younger. So you can't make too many judgments from this, but it just gives you an idea of what you're dealing with and whether you're dealing with a fairly concrete person or not also. So that's one. How are a chair and a table similar? Well, they're both furniture is the abstract answer. They both have 4 legs is a concrete answer. But the most fun for me is proverbs. I've collected a bunch of them, and you want to see if people can tell you what a proverb means other than its most obvious thing. So when you say people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, sometimes people will say that means you break the glass. And you're like, yeah, but what would you mean? Is there a deeper layer of meaning to that? And they say, well, yeah, you don't want people to break the glass, and so if they throw stones in a glass house, they'll break the glass. You're like, yeah, but why would you say that to somebody? If you walked up to somebody and you felt the need to say people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, why would you say that? What would the circumstances be? Sometimes people, even people who fairly well intact, are like, well, you don't want them to break the glass. The abstract version would be something like, well, when you have your own vulnerabilities and fragilities, maybe you don't want to be critical of other people for the kinds of things that they could level back at you or could rebound to you in some other way. Maybe you should exercise a little caution in what you say. That would be a little more abstract. Or you could say, it means that we all live in an interconnected world. We live in a complex filigree, a network in which anything that you say to anyone else, which might be aggressive or hurtful particularly, is already hurtful to you. Because in a network, we all live in a fragile network in a glass house, so that anything that you say affects you. If you hurt somebody else, you hurt yourself indirectly, because we're all a part of a single larger entity. That would be abstract enough. Probably if you answered that to a neurologist, he'd send you to a psychiatrist, but it's still a great answer. The guy who says glass houses break the glass, that may be a perfectly, I went to medical school with a guy who was like that, and he's a very successful, wonderful guy. You just wouldn't necessarily want him writing a philosophy paper for you or something like that. The reason I bring this up is that I have a slogan, which I mentioned before. It is get a grip and then loosen it. That's what you have to do. But obviously, I don't mean that when you're swinging a baseball bat or a tennis racket or something that, or a golf club, that's true. You should get a grip. It should be a firm grip, and then you should loosen it to introduce the kind of play that allows you to really make use of the grip. That's true, but that's not what's so interesting about it. In a subsequent video, I'm going to demonstrate ways in which literal physical grip works better when it's relaxed than when it's tense. But of course, what I'm really talking about is psychological. That's what get a grip really means. It's a psychological idea. And then when we're talking about loosening it or becoming more psychologically flexible, that we can do to advantage. And that's really what I mean. But it's an extension of the physical idea. It's an abstraction from the physical idea of a grip. So that's the idea, and we'll see what we can do with it.